A woman stands in the middle of a muddy street, one hand on the gun at her hip, the other holding a leather ledger like it's the only thing keeping her upright. Across from her, a man in an expensive coat who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. He's about to be, behind her, a mountain man who ordered a wife for $30 and received something entirely different. Something that survived his coldest winter. Something that refused every single time to break. But the mountain almost took her before he could admit he wanted her to stay. And the man in the expensive coat has been waiting since October for the snow to clear. It just cleared Colorado territory. 1878. Some debts aren't about money. Some winters don't end with the thaw. And some men don't know what they've been building until someone worth keeping finally walks through the door. Mud doesn't care what you paid for your boots. Ely Crane knew that the way a man knows the weight of his own axe not from thinking about it, but from 10,000 mornings of picking it up. The mud of Bitter Creek in October was a particular breed of misery, not the clean, dark mud of a riverbank after rain. This was 3 parts horse manure, 1 part sawdust, 1 part whatever the slaughterhouse on the east end of town let drain into the alley when nobody official was watching. It smelled like failure. It smelled like every man who'd come through this territory with ambitions bigger than his provisions, and ended up selling his gear at half price before winter hit. Ely stood under the slanting overhang of the livery and chewed on the inside of his cheek. He'd been in Bitter Creek since 7 in the morning. It was now past noon. The stagecoach from Denver was late, which meant he'd been standing in this patch of stinking October air for 5 hours with nothing to do but think. He was not a man built for thinking. He was built for doing for the clean physicality of work that left his hands raw and his mind mercifully empty. 5 hours of standing and thinking was roughly 4 hours and 50 minutes more than he could manage without the thoughts turning toward Ruth. Her face kept surfacing, the way it always did when he came to town. Something about the noise, the press of bodies, the sharp domestic smell of wood smoke coming from the hotel kitchen, it dragged her up from wherever he'd managed to bury her and set her right in front of him, clear as the day she died. He ground his back teeth together and looked at the road. The letter he'd sent east 6 months ago had been practical. 3 sentences. He needed a woman who could survive altitude, handle a wood stove, and wasn't bothered by silence. He'd enclosed $30 and a description of the work involved. He had not described the cabin as comfortable because it wasn't. He had not described himself as easy to live with because that would have been a lie. He had asked for a widow, preferably. Someone who'd already done the hard math of loss and come out the other side knowing what mattered and what didn't. Someone broad-shouldered and plain-featured who would look at the ridge and see shelter rather than punishment. He had been specific about plain, pretty women expected things. Pretty women had a way of looking at a man that made him aware of the distance between who he was and who he was supposed to be. He didn't have the patience for it. He didn't have the softness. He'd spent 5 years burning both of those things out of himself, like you burn a field in late autumn deliberately, thoroughly, down to the black roots, and he had no intention of growing them back. The stagecoach rounded the bend from the south road. 4 horses lathered white at the shoulder, blowing clouds of steam into the cold air, hooves churning the mud into fresh chaos. The driver hauled back on the reins with both arms, the wooden brakes screaming against the wheel rim. The coach settled into the muck with a groan that Ely felt in his back teeth. He stepped out from under the overhang, pulling the collar of his oilskin up around his neck, and waited. A traveling man came out first. Round, red-faced, a sample case banging against his knee. He looked around Bitter Creek with the expression of a man calculating how quickly he could leave. Then something stopped Ely cold. The man paused at the base of the coach step and turned back, as if he'd forgotten something inside. But his eyes weren't on the coach. They were scanning the street, methodical. The way a man looks when he's been paid to look. He had a small black notebook in his vest pocket that he touched once, briefly. Before his gaze settled on the livery overhang where Ely stood, the man looked away, tucked the notebook deeper into his pocket, moved toward the hotel with his sample case banging at his knee. Ely filed the man's face away without moving. A prospector came out next, stinking of wet wool and the sour smell of someone who'd been wearing the same clothes for 2 weeks. Then nothing. A long pause. Just the creak of the coach settling on its springs and the wind picking up off the eastern plain. The tight knot of something not hope, not relief, He refused to call it either, started forming in his gut. Maybe she hadn't come. Maybe the agency had taken his $30 and found nobody willing. The mountain had been trying to tell him something for 5 years and he kept refusing to listen. And then a gloved hand reached out and gripped the door frame. Small hand. The leather dyed a deep, impractical plum the color of something that had no business existing in a town that was 90% mud. Eli stopped breathing. Not a dramatic stoppage. Just the ordinary kind where the body forgets what it was doing because something has short-circuited the mechanisms. She stepped down, didn't stumble. The drop from the coach step to the ground was steep and she was not tall, but she landed with a steadiness that suggested she'd decided before her feet left the step that she was not going to fall. The hem of her dark woolen traveling dress hit the mud immediately. She didn't look down at it. Her face hit him the way a wagon wheel hits a frozen rut, sudden, jarring, the kind of impact that reverberates up through every bone. High cheekbones, skin pale as the underside of birch bark in winter. Eyes the gray of storm clouds when the light comes through them sideways, not soft gray, not gentle gray. Cold gray, sharp gray, the gray of a river that will drown you if you stop paying attention. Her hair was pulled severely under a dark hat, heavy chestnut with a reddish undertone where the weak October sun caught it. She looked at Bitter Creek the way a general looks at terrain before a battle. Not horrified, not delighted, just assessing, taking inventory. Her expression said, "I see what this is. I am calculating accordingly." Eli's stomach dropped, not desire, not attraction. He wasn't going to give it either of those names because those names led somewhere he had sealed off. What it actually was in the cold, honest gut of him was terror. The specific, suffocating terror of a man who had watched a woman with that same particular fragility stand in snow up to her knees and not come back. Ruth hadn't been beautiful the way this woman was beautiful, but she'd had that quality of being too fine for what the mountain was going to demand of her. He'd been wrong about Ruth being strong enough. He'd paid for that miscalculation in a way that had no bottom. Behind him, he registered the round traveling man disappearing through the hotel door without looking back. Gone too quickly for a man who'd just arrived somewhere new. Eli filed that too, then made himself walk. His boots made sucking sounds in the mud. He crossed the distance and stopped 3 feet from her. Up close, the smell of her reached him, lavender and cold rain, absurdly incongruous, like finding a music box in a trapper's pack. It made something ache in his chest that he had no name for and didn't want one. "You Ada Marsh?" The words came out rougher than intended. He hadn't spoken more than 20 words together in 3 weeks. She turned her head. Her eyes met his straight on. Not shy, not flirtatious. Just direct, with that exhausted hardness underneath the look of someone who has been braced for impact for a long time and is simply waiting to see what shape it takes. "I am a beat." "Are you Eli Crane?" "Yeah." He looked her over. The narrowness of her shoulders, the delicate line of her neck above the collar of a coat that was expensive, well-made, and entirely wrong for where she was going. The fine oval of her nails above the edge of those impractical plum gloves, they sent the wrong woman. The words were right there. He almost said them. He wanted to. He wanted to march her to the stage office and demand a reversal and put her back on the next coach east and be done with the whole impossible idea. Her chin tipped up. "I have the papers." Quiet. Steady, jaw set like a woman who had rehearsed this moment in the dark. "Papers don't chop wood," he said it too loud. A miner passing behind her glanced over. Eli lowered his voice and stepped closer. He had 8 inches on her at minimum. He was aware of that, aware of the way it should have made her step back. She didn't step back. "You can't survive up there. Look at you. You're too." He stopped. He'd been about to say beautiful, which was a concession he wasn't making. "Soft," he finished. "You're too soft." Her chin came up another 1/4 inch. Rain was beading on her eyelashes. She blinked it away without breaking eye contact. "I paid my own fare from some St. Louis." Each word precise, deliberate. "Because your $30 covered only half the ticket. I am your wife by proxy, signed 4 days ago. I am not getting back on that coach." He glared at her. She glared back. The air between them was the kind that happens before lightning, the kind where your body knows something before your mind does. He wanted to end this right now. But the coach was already moving toward the stables, and the next service to Denver didn't run for 14 days. Eli spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud, narrowly cleared her boot. She looked at the small brown splash beside her foot and then back at him, expression unchanged. "Where's your trunk?" Behind you, he turned. A steamer trunk sat in the muck brass-bound dark leather, approximately the weight of a full-grown heifer. He walked over to it, hoisted it onto his right shoulder with a grunt he wasn't entirely in control of. The leather handle dug into his collarbone like a promise of future pain. Wagon's east side of the livery. He didn't wait to see if she followed. He just walked, listening for the sound of small boots pulling free of the mud behind him. They came steadily without hesitation, and he did not find this reassuring. The buckboard had no springs because springs were a luxury, and Eli Crane had not been in the business of luxuries for a long time. The two mules, Beck and Cora, knew the road up the ridge the way old women know the route to automatically. With mild resentment. The climb took 3 hours. The road switched back twice, climbed through a stand of old-growth Douglas fir, where the light went green and strange, then broke out above the tree line onto the high ridge where the wind was a living thing with opinions. Ely drove with the reins loose, letting the mules manage. Beside him, Ada sat rigidly upright. She had been rigidly upright for 2 hours. The air was a good 20 degrees colder than Bitter Creek had been, sharp enough to cut, and she was shivering, not a delicate performance, but the deep involuntary kind, the kind the body does when it has stopped being polite about the cold. He reached behind the seat without looking at her. His hand found the spare blanket by feel rough wool, heavy with lanolin and the smell of mule and old wood smoke. He dragged it forward and dropped it on her lap. She flinched at the sudden movement, looked down at the coarse, shapeless thing. Wrap up, flat, informational. Wind gets worse from here. Thank you. Her teeth were chattering around the words. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. It snagged on the fine weave of her coat. She looked, he was grimly aware, like a porcelain figure that someone had tried to pack for shipping using entirely the wrong materials. He turned his gaze back to the road. He waited for the complaining to start. Women who came through Bitter Creek complained about everything: the smell, the prices, the attitude of the men. She had been jolted, frozen, and subjected to his company for 2.5 hours, and she had not said one word about any of it. This did not make him feel better, it made him feel worse. He had constructed a very specific narrative to protect himself, and her silence was dismantling it plank by plank without asking his permission. The wagon cleared the tree line and the cabin came into view against the gray granite face of the ridge. Small rough-hewn log walls, mud and horsehair chinking, sod roof heavy and low, no porch, oiled paper instead of glass in the 2 small windows, a woodpile stacked shoulder-high against the north wall, a lean-to attached on the east side for Beck and Cora. It looked exactly like what it was, a wooden box designed by a man who did not expect winter to be optional. He pulled the mules to a halt. The silence after the creak of the wagon stopped was enormous. Wind in the pines below, and under that, nothing. The particular nothing of a place that has not heard a human voice in weeks. He looked at her. She was looking at the cabin. Her throat moved. He watched her swallow once convulsively. It ain't St. Louis testing. Waiting for the crack. No, her voice was quiet. Even, it isn't. She climbed down before he could do whatever the alternative to offering his hand was. Her legs gave for half a second when she hit the ground, numbed from the cold and the ride, but she caught herself on the wagon wheel without making a sound about it. He noticed. He pretended he hadn't. He unhitched the mules, led them into the lean-to, and made himself focus entirely on that task. Hay from the wagon bed, water bucket, the comfortable animal logic of creatures who required only food and warmth. He grabbed her trunk next, hauled it to the door, kicked the latch. It stuck. It always stuck. He needed to fix the damn latch, and dropped the trunk inside, with a thud that echoed off bare walls. Bring the supplies from the wagon bed. He pointed to the flour sack and the coffee tin without looking at her. Then he walked back to the lean-to to hang the mule tack and give himself 2 more minutes of not having to be inside that small room with her. When he came back, she was standing in the center of the cabin. The air inside smelled of cold ash and cured meat, and the particular staleness of a space that had held only one person for too long. The oiled paper windows let in a sickly yellowed light that turned everything the color of old teeth. She was still holding the flour sack against her chest. She had set the coffee tin on the rough table. She was looking at the iron stove, the narrow bed built into the corner wall, the single chair, the line of dried herbs hanging from a ceiling peg, and her expression was the careful blank of a woman who had decided before she arrived that she was not going to react to whatever she found. He moved past her without speaking. grabbed kindling from the bin by the door, stuffed it into the belly of the stove, struck a match on the ice and sulfur flare, acrid and sharp, burning his nostrils. The dry wood caught, flour goes in the barrel. He kept his eyes on the small flame. The heavy sack hit the bottom of the wooden barrel with a soft thud. Then, where do I put my things? He stood up, brushed his hands on his canvas trousers, gestured toward the corner opposite the bed without looking at her. There, no wardrobe. She nodded once and moved to the trunk. He looked away before the lid came up. He'd already caught a glimpse: white lace, the spine of a leather book, the glint of a silver mirror handle, and he didn't need to look at it again. He didn't need to think about what it meant that she'd carried those things 1,000 miles to a sod-roofed cabin on a granite ridge. He grabbed the water bucket. Checking traps, he lied. He had checked the traps yesterday. Stove heats up in an hour. Don't touch the rifles. He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped outside and let the cold wind do what the cold wind always did, which was to make everything feel smaller and more manageable by comparison. He stayed behind the lean-to until his toes went entirely numb. He had expected, on the ride up, to feel resolved. The cold and the altitude usually imposed their own clarity, burning away everything that wasn't essential and leaving behind only the things that mattered. Instead, his chest was doing something he didn't have language for, a frantic, caged quality, like a man who has opened a door and now can't remember what he came into the room for and also can't leave. He braced himself for the sound of a woman's hysteria when he pushed the cabin door open. He had rehearsed his response. "I told you so. The coach comes back in 14 days. What he found was not hysteria. She had stripped off the plum coat and the dark hat. Without them, she looked smaller and somehow, paradoxically, more present. She wore a dark blue dress, the fabric slightly wrinkled from travel but precisely cut, clinging at the waist, entirely unsuited for sweeping a dirt floor, which was exactly what she was doing. She had found his ragged broom of bound twigs and was methodically pushing a pile of tracked-in mud and cedar chips toward the threshold. Strands of chestnut hair had worked loose from her pins, curling against her pale neck in the warmth the stove was just beginning to produce. Ely stopped in the doorway. He felt big, clumsy, and intensely dirty. "You don't need to do that." She paused, leaning on the broom handle, looked up at him. Those gray eyes had the same quality up close in firelight that they'd had in the mud of the street, direct to the point of uncomfortable, with something behind them that was exhausted but nowhere near broken. The floor was dirty. It's a dirt floor. There are boards under here. She pointed the broom at the uneven planks. "I prefer to see them." He closed the door. The howl of the wind dropped to a murmur. He unbuckled his gun belt. The heavy leather and steel thud of it on the table made her flinch, just fractionally, and moved to the storage box under the table. There were 3 things in Eli Crane's life that he had kept entirely private. The first was Ruth's dress, folded under the blankets in the ryewood box at the head of the bed. The second was the small graves behind the lean-to. The third was this, that he could take dried huckleberries, a strip of venison, 2 shriveled onions, and a handful of dried thyme from last summer's cutting, and produce something that made men close their eyes when they ate it. His mother had said that cooking was the most honest thing a person could do, because you couldn't fake flavor and you couldn't hide from what you put into it. She'd grown up in a hollow in the Virginia mountains with nothing to work with most of the time, and she had never made a meal that tasted like that was true. He hadn't cooked for anyone in 5 years. He hadn't intended to start tonight. He'd intended the salt pork and the beans, the deliberately bad meal of a man communicating that this was not a comfortable arrangement, and she should manage her expectations accordingly. But his hands were already doing something else. The dried thyme crushed between his palms, receiving its sharp, clean smell. The onion halved and face down on the hot iron, beginning to caramelize with a sizzle that filled the small room. The venison from the back larder, sliced thin, set to sear. Ada had stopped sweeping. She was standing with the broom handle still in her hand, watching him with an expression somewhere between surprise and caution, the look of a person who has heard a sound they weren't expecting and haven't yet determined whether it's dangerous. "You know how to cook." Not quite a question. More like a fact she was turning over. He didn't answer. He turned the venison. The smell in the cabin was transforming from cold ash and stale air into something warm that had no business being up here on the ridge. The kind of smell that pulled at the lower, older part of the brain, the part that registered safety before the mind caught up. He set the tin plate in front of her without ceremony. Venison with caramelized onion and dried thyme, a heel of bread he'd baked 4 days ago that was still more than edible, and coffee made correctly grounds in the linen bag, water just below the full boil. Sat, looked at the plate, then up at him. My mother taught me. He sat down across from her and took up his own fork. She's been dead 20 years. Don't make a thing of it, she ate. She didn't make a thing of it. She ate the way someone eats who has been hungry for a long time and has learned not to show it methodically, with a focus that was almost private. She finished everything on the plate. She drank the coffee without wincing at the strength of it, and then she sat with her hands around the tin cup and looked at the stove, and the firelight caught the side of her face, and Eli looked away before she could catch him looking. The reality of the night settled over the cabin like weather. One bed, built into the corner, piled with a bare pelt and 2 worn quilts. He stood up from the table and took one of the quilts and the spare horse blanket from the peg by the door, dropped them on the floor beside the stove. Ada's chair scraped back. "What are you doing?" "Making a bed I can sleep by the stove," said with her hands gripping the chair back, and under the flatness of it was something complicated, a woman trying to establish the terms of an arrangement she hadn't been given terms for. He turned slowly, looked at her, at the dark circles under her grey eyes that had nothing to do with the bad light, at the fine trembling of her hands on the chair back that wasn't cold, wasn't fear, but the bone weariness of a person at the absolute end of a long road. You wouldn't last 3 hours on these boards. "Take the bed." A pause. "I paid for a partner. Someone to pull their weight." "I don't," he stopped. Started over. "Take the bed, Ada." Her face went red. A darker, sharp flush, not embarrassment, but the specific feeling of a true thing said before you were ready to hear it. She turned away, spine straight as a fence post, and walked to the corner bed. She didn't undress. She unlaced her boots, 2 soft thuds on the floorboards, and crawled under the bare pelt fully clothed. Turned her face to the log wall. He blew out the oil lamp. Darkness took the room except for the seams of orange light leaking from the stove grate. The wind was working on the roof now, finding the gaps in the sod, a low persistent moan. He lay down on the floor, the horse blanket scratching his chin, the boards under him unyielding in the way of objects that have not been asked to be comfortable. He stared at the ceiling he couldn't see, and beneath the wind, beneath the tick of the cooling stovepipe, he heard her breathing. Shallow, deliberate, the careful, controlled breathing of a woman who was not going to let him hear her cry. He lay there for a long time, a man who had wanted a certain kind of wife and had received an entirely different problem, a problem that smelled like lavender and would not complain and had eaten every bite of the best meal he'd cooked in 5 years without saying a single word about it. He did not sleep. The fire died at 3 in the morning. He knew before he was fully awake the cold came in not as a breeze but as a presence, settling directly into the marrow. He rolled off the floor, joints protesting, breath blooming white in the dark. He glanced toward the corner, a small motionless shape under the bear pelt, pulled entirely over her head. He moved in the dark by memory, stove door, poker ash scraped aside to find 3 red coals still alive. Pine needles first, then kindling, then his breath steady and low until the flame caught. He grabbed his coat, his axe, a bucket, and went outside. The morning was violent in the way only high-altitude October can produce. 2 inches of dry powder snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the mud in unbroken white. The sky was pale ice blue and cloudless. The air was so cold it had a taste clean and sharp and completely without mercy. He broke the stream ice with the back of the axe, filled the bucket, checked on Beck and Cora, split a cord of cedar by the feel of the grain. The labor warmed him from the inside out and occupied the space in his head that he didn't want anything else in. When he came back inside with split wood and the sloshing bucket, Ada was awake. She stood by the stove with her hands cupped around nothing, trying to pull warmth from the air. Her hair was completely down, had come unpinned during the night, a heavy cascade of dark waves over her shoulders. She'd wrapped a shawl over her dress but was still shivering, the fine tremor of a body that had gotten cold all the way to the core. I tried to start the coffee. Her voice was rough from sleep. She nodded toward the stove. His enameled blue pot sat over the hot iron, lid rattling, a dark liquid boiling over the spout and hissing onto the hot surface in small bursts of acrid steam. He set the wood in the bin, crossed to the stove, lifted the lid with the leather pad. Ada had poured the grounds directly into the water, far too many. No filtering cloth, and what was in the pot was a thick, boiling black sludge. He set the lid down, picked up the pot and walked to the door and threw the whole thing out into the snow. It melted a dark, ugly hole in the pristine spear white. Her shoulders dropped. I just wanted to have it ready when you came back. Coffee's $1 a pound in town. He kept his voice flat. Factual, not cruel, just the math. We don't waste it, I understand. Her voice tightened around the edges. She reached for the water bucket he'd just brought in. I'll try again. With the cloth this time, the bucket was full, close to 30 pounds of freezing water. Her fingers were stiff, the grip uncertain. He could see it coming before it came, the tilt, the overcorrection, the moment the physics became inevitable. Don't! The bucket hit the iron lip of the stove. Water sloshed over the side, hit the hot metal with a sound like a struck snake, and exploded upward in a massive cloud of white steam. Ada gasped, stumbled back, hands flying to her chest. Ely lunged forward and got the bucket before it fully inverted, slammed it flat on the table. Water spread across the planks in a slow fan, dripping steadily off the edge onto the floor. He turned on her, frustration boiling over the rim of something that had been building since yesterday, since the stagecoach, since the mud, since those gray eyes had looked at him and not been impressed. Are you burned? Did the steam get you? No, wide-eyed, pale. I'm fine. I'm sorry, my hands were. Stop saying you're sorry. He grabbed a rag from the peg and dropped it onto the puddle on the table. I told you yesterday you can't handle what's up here. You don't know how to make coffee. You can't lift a water bucket. What did you think this was going to be like? She flinched, and then the exhaustion in her eyes ignited, a sudden fierce spark that changed everything about her face. I didn't think it would be easy. Her voice shook, but it was loud. Deliberate. I thought it would be survival. I know I don't know what I'm doing. But I am trying, and you have not given me one single instruction, Eli. You just stand there looking at me like I'm a disease you picked up in town. He stared at her. Her chest was heaving under the shawl. Her eyes were bright and blazing and completely unashamed of it. I didn't ask for, and I didn't ask for a palace. She took a step toward him. The lavender smell was gone now. She smelled like wood smoke and cold air and old wool, which was oddly more confrontational than the lavender had been. Show me how to use the cloth. Show me how much water to use. Tell me what goes wrong if I do it wrong. I am not useless. I am unpracticed. There is a difference, and you know there is. She reached out and took the empty coffee pot from his hand. Her fingers brushed his knuckles. Her skin was freezing cold, chipped ice against the permanent heat of his palms. He looked down at the contact and then up at her face. The defiant spark was still there, daring him to take the pot back. He exhaled slowly. The frustration drained out in a single breath, leaving behind something heavier. He reached for the linen bag on its nail behind the stove. 2 handfuls of grounds. His voice came out low, gruff, no more. Tie it tight at the top so the cloth stays closed. Water just below boiling, not a full boil, or it goes bitter. She watched his hands with a precision that was almost uncomfortable, noting each movement, filing it away. She didn't thank him. She just took the bag and began filling it, measuring, careful. He turned to clean up the spilled water, and for a long time the only sounds in the cabin were the 2 of them working the rag on the table, the soft tap of grounds fickling cloth, the low, steady ticking of the stovepipe, and it was not, he realized, an entirely unpleasant sound. 3 days passed in the rhythm of 2 people who had agreed to coexist without having agreed on anything else. Ely chopped wood. Ada hauled water the half-full bucket, which he had started filling only to the halfway mark without explaining why, and which she had started using without asking why. He checked the trap lines on the south slope. She fed the stove while he was gone, figured out the draft on the second day, had the fire the right temperature when he came back. They moved in the 15 by 15 space like 2 dogs circling the same territory, aware of each other at all times, careful not to collide, careful not to establish a pattern that suggested more than they had negotiated. By the 4th afternoon, the sky turned the dark iron color that Eli's joints had been predicting for 2 days. The wind died. That was the tell, not the clouds, but the sudden absence, the air going heavy and still, like it was taking a breath before something large. He kicked the door open. 2 jackrabbits hit the table, heavy, frozen, dark-eyed, ears flat. Ada was on her trunk, mending a tear in her skirt, a silver needle catching the dim light. She stopped, looked at the carcasses, their glassy eyes, the matted dark blood frozen into the fur. He pulled his hunting knife and laid it on the table beside them. You want to learn? Not a question. A door opening, she stood up, set the needle and fabric aside, walked to the table, looked at the rabbits, not away from them, at them, and swallowed once. Hard. How? He stepped up behind her. Close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his canvas coat. He reached over her shoulder, picked up the knife, and began to explain. The starting point at the hind leg, the shallow cut, the danger of puncturing the gut sac. His voice was low and close and entirely focused on the mechanics, which was the only way he knew how to do this, to stay in the technical and out of the personal. He made the first incision around the ankle of the near rabbit, then handed the knife over her shoulder. The staghorn handle looked wrong in her small hand, too large. But her grip was correct. Instinctively, she'd found the balance point. She pressed the blade to the hide. Deeper, he watched the angle. It's not silk, you have to commit. She pressed harder. The skin parted with a sound. She clearly hadn't been prepared for that wet, tearing release. Her eyes squeezed shut for a fraction of a second, then opened. She kept going. The pale muscle came into view beneath the fur. The smell changed, rawer, earthier, the smell of something recently alive. She worked her way down without stopping, set the knife down and grabbed the severed edges of the hide with both hands and pulled. The hide gave way slowly, and then all at once, stripping down like a glove turned inside out. She was panting slightly, brow furrowed, dark stains spreading across her cuffs, and yet she didn't stop. She picked up the knife again to work around the front legs. Her hand was trembling, not from fear but from the sustained effort of focusing intensely on something that required everything she had. The blade caught on a slick patch of fat. The knife clattered to the table. He moved before he'd decided to. Grabbed her wrist, turned her hand palm up, a thin, bright line of red across the meat of her index finger, not deep, but clean and freely bleeding. He held her wrist and felt something move through him that was not anger at her, and was not concern in any straightforward sense, some complicated third thing he chose not to examine. He pulled the clean rag from his back pocket, pressed it firmly against the cut. Her skin was cold as creek water in April. His pulse was doing something strange against his own thumb, where it pressed down to stop the bleeding. I'm sorry, don't. He kept his eyes on her hand. Sit down. I haven't finished. Sit down, she sat. In 4 motions he stripped the hide, gutted the carcass, and had the offal in the bucket. He moved fast, deliberately, with the kind of efficiency that is actually a form of self-punishment. He'd made her do it to prove a point. He'd wanted to see her refuse, to cry, to demand the coach. Instead, she had bled on his table and kept going. Somehow that was worse than anything she could have said. He went to her. She was holding the wrapped finger against her chest, looking at the floor with the expression of someone taking internal inventory. Does it sting? She looked up. Yes, honest. No decoration around it. But I learned the hindquarters. I'll be faster next time. He felt it then, that pulling sensation in his chest he'd been cataloguing and refusing to name. He was not looking at a porcelain doll anymore. He had not been for at least a day. He was looking at a woman who was making herself into something the mountain required. One hard lesson at a time, and doing it without asking him to soften the lessons. That was a problem. That was a considerably more complicated problem than the one he'd started with. The 5th evening he cooked without pretense. He'd been halfway to the salt pork and caught himself. Put it back. Got the venison haunch from the cold larder instead. Huckleberries from the summer's putting up, shriveled but still rich. The dried onions, the thyme and sage crushed between his palms. A spoonful of the wild honey he'd taken from a tree cavity on the north slope in August, stirred into the reducing pot at the end until the whole thing went dark and fragrant. Ada was at the table with her, mending again the same skirt, which had acquired a new tear when she'd misjudged the step over the threshold. She looked up when the smell reached her. Then at him, my mother taught me, he said before she could ask. He turned the pan. She grew up in a hollow in the Virginia mountains. She said the mark of whether you were actually present in your own life was whether you took trouble with your food. He hadn't meant to say that much. He stopped. Ada set down her mending, quietly. She sounds like she was worth knowing. She was. He put the plates on the table and sat down. Dead when I was 15. Fever at 8. He ate. The fire talked to itself in the stove. Outside the wind was picking up again, carrying the distant smell of something colder moving in from the north. The food is extraordinary. She said it simply. Not a compliment performed for his benefit, a statement of observable fact. the way you'd note that the weather had changed. He looked at her across the table. She was looking at her plate, cutting the last piece of venison with the focus she gave to every physical task. Dark stains still on her cuffs from the afternoon. A small white bandage on her finger that she'd rebandaged herself. Why did you really come here? He hadn't planned to ask it. It came out because it was the actual question, the one underneath all the others. Women like you don't answer ads from mountain men unless the alternative is worse. What were you running from? She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then a debt. She set her fork down, looked at the stove. My father was a merchant in St. Louis. He died owing $4,000 to a man named Virgil Cord. Cord owns a meatpacking operation and controls 3 judges in Jackson County. A pause. Cord didn't want the money. He wanted a young wife to bring to dinner parties. He told the magistrate he'd consider the debt cleared if I agreed to marry him. $4,000. Eli said nothing. Let the number sit. He has hands like slabs of river clay. Her voice was flat, precise. The voice of someone who has gone over these facts many times in the dark and stripped them of the power to hurt. He smells of old blood and cheap tobacco. He keeps dogs and he hits them in the morning the way other men drink coffee. I watched him do it twice through a window before I decided I was not going to be in that house when winter came. She turned and looked at him directly. I found your advertisement in the agency ledger. $30. A cabin 1,000 miles away, high enough up that Cord's men wouldn't climb to look. I forged the magistrate's signature on the proxy. A pause. The smallest, most exhausted precision in the next words. I left before sunrise. Ellie absorbed this. Looked at her wrists, her eyes. The set of her jaw that had not softened once since she stepped off the stagecoach. She had not come here looking for rescue. She hadn't come looking for warmth or companionship. She had looked at the ridge the way a general looks at terrain, calculated the elevation, the distance, the likelihood of pursuit, and decided the mountain was a better bet than the man who wanted to own her. You didn't want a husband. His voice came out quieter than he intended. You wanted a fortress. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more tired than that and more honest. And you didn't want a wife. You wanted a workhorse. He looked at her across the rough table in the firelight and felt the framework he'd built around himself, the careful, deliberate architecture of a man who had decided he was done with certain categories of feeling shift in a way he could not account for and could not stop. He stood up and picked up the plates. You're too skinny to be a workhorse anyway. He said it with his back to her. Eat the bread too. She ate the bread. Outside, the wind picked up another register. Eli stood at the larder calculating supplies with a variable he hadn't been using before, not one person through 5 months of winter but 2. One of them still learning the most basic arithmetic of survival, both of them with more unsaid between them than said. He banked the stove for the night, lay down on the floor, above the wind, below everything, steady and quiet, her breathing, slower tonight, deeper. She was already asleep. He lay in the dark with the strange pulling feeling in his chest that had no name yet. Then he thought about the damp ground behind the lean-to, where the frost was settling over 2 small mounds of turned earth, and the chill in his gut that had nothing to do with the cold of the floor. And then something else pulled him back to the present. The round-faced traveling man from the stagecoach. The one who'd scanned the street before he moved. The one with the small black notebook. The one who had disappeared into the hotel too quickly for a man who'd just arrived somewhere new. Ellie reached into his coat pocket, which he'd hung by the door, which he always searched before sleeping out of a habit built from years alone in country where anything could happen, and found what he'd found before supper. A scrap of paper, folded once, that he'd pulled from the gap between 2 logs on the north wall, while splitting wood in the late afternoon, while Ada had been inside with her mending. While he'd dismissed the sound of something brushing against the far side of the cabin as the wind, he unfolded it in the dark. He knew what it said. He'd read it twice already, 3 words. A single initial confirmed location, P. He lay in the dark with the note in his hand and listened to Ada sleeping 12 feet away, and thought about the man with the notebook, and thought about the name Virgil Cord, and thought about what $4,000 bought a man who owned 3 judges and was not accustomed to losing. She didn't know yet. He needed to decide how long that lasted. He kept the note in his coat pocket for 6 days, not because he didn't know what to do with it. Because every time he reached a decision, He looked at Ada doing something, hauling the half bucket without being told, wringing out the coffee cloth over the snow so it wouldn't mold, standing at the oiled paper window in the mornings watching the ridge wake up, with an expression he couldn't categorize, and the decision dissolved back into something unresolved. He locked the cabin door during the day, both bolts. She noticed on the second day, didn't ask. That was the thing about her that kept catching him sideways. She noticed everything and asked about almost nothing. She filed information away behind those gray eyes and waited until she had enough of it to act. He recognized that quality because it was his own quality, and recognizing it in someone else was deeply uncomfortable in a way he had no precedent for. The cold deepened. Not the dramatic cold of the storm still building to the north, just the ordinary, grinding cold of high-altitude late October. The kind that didn't announce itself, but simply moved in and started taking up residence in the walls and the floor and the space between a man's shoulder blades while he slept, or tried to sleep. Eli had not been sleeping well since Ada arrived, which he attributed to the changed acoustics of the room, another person's breathing, the occasional shift of weight on the rope springs, and which he refused to attribute to anything else. The morning of the 6th day he came back from the trap line with 2 jackrabbits and a headache from the wind, pushed open the cabin door, and found the room warm, the coffee correctly made, and Ada standing at the table kneading bread dough with the focused intensity of a woman who had decided she was going to master this specific thing regardless of the cost. Her hands were white with flour to the wrists. She had the rhythm wrong, too much pressing, not enough folding, but she'd worked out that there was a rhythm and was trying to find it, which was more than he'd expected on day 6 of anything. He hung the rabbits on the peg by the door without comment. She looked up, looked at the rabbits. Back at the dough, I watched what you did last time, not asking for approval. Explaining her methodology, he sat down and pulled off his boots. His feet were cold through the wool socks, the chill sitting deep in the ankle joints. He looked at her hands moving in the dough. Fold it toward you. Push away with the heel. You're pressing it flat. You want to build structure, not destroyest it, she adjusted. The rhythm changed, not perfect, but closer. He got up to check the rabbits. Started the skinning without offering to let her finish what she'd begun the other day. Her finger had healed to a thin pink line, but he wasn't going to push it. Not today. She worked the dough in silence. He worked the rabbits in silence. The stove was doing its job and the cabin smelled of bread coming and of cold air on canvas and of the intimate smell of 2 people who had been breathing the same air for 6 days without once getting to the bottom of each other. He became aware gradually that she was watching him, not watching the rabbits, watching him, the way a person watches a problem they're trying to solve when they think the problem isn't paying attention. Ask it. His back was still to her. A pause. Ask what? Whatever you've been not asking since yesterday morning. Another pause. Longer. The cross behind the lean-to. Careful. Even. Testing the ground before she put her weight on it. I saw you out there 2 nights ago. I wasn't trying to. I heard a sound. I opened the door and then I saw and I went back inside. He kept his hands moving on the rabbit. You did? I didn't ask then. No, I'm asking now. He set the knife down. Not dramatically. Just set it on the table and stood with his hands flat on the rough wood grain for a moment, looking at the larder door, which had a crack in the bottom board he'd been meaning to repair since August. My wife. The 2 words came out like something that had been under pressure for a long time and found a seam. And my son. He didn't make it to being born. November 73. Ada's hands had stopped in the dough. He didn't look at her. There was a storm, the kind that comes down from the north in about 40 minutes, and closes the pass before you can get a wagon out. I knew she was close to her time. I should have taken her down to Bitter Creek a week before 2 weeks. The doctor there, Farwell, he'd told me come down early. I had 1 more week of work on the lean-to roof, 1 more week of fencing on the south pasture. He picked up the knife again. His hands needed to be doing something. I told myself it would be fine. The bread dough sat untouched in Ada's hands. I couldn't get the wagon down once the storm hit. Couldn't get down on foot either, not that there was anything to do if I had. She was in labor for 18 hours. I did everything I could think to do, and it wasn't enough. He stripped the last of the hide from the second rabbit with a single clean pull. I buried them behind the lean-to because the ground there gets the morning sun first, and because I couldn't carry them any further in ground that was frozen. Silence. The kind that isn't empty but is full of something being very carefully held. That is why you didn't want me here. Not a question. Her voice was very quiet. I didn't want you here because you looked like someone I'd already failed to keep alive. He turned around. She was standing at the table with flour to her wrists and her gray eyes doing something complicated that he wasn't going to look at directly. That's not your fault, and it's not a thing I'm going to fix by talking about it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back down at the dough and began working it again. Slowly. The correct way this time, heel of the hand, fold toward her, quarter turn. She didn't say she was sorry. He was grateful for that. Sorry was for things that could be undone. My father was sorry, she said after a while, her voice even. Just talking, in the way of someone putting something into the air because it fits. He was sorry for every bad investment, every failed venture. Every morning he woke up with the ledger 20% worse than the night before. Sorry is the word people use when they've run out of actions. Ellie looked at the back of her head. The heavy chestnut braid she'd switched to after the first week because the pins kept slipping in the dry air. He looked at it for a moment longer than he meant to, then turned back to the rabbit. He put the carcasses in the pot with water and salt and the last of the dried carrots and set it over the stove, and neither of them said anything else about it. That was exactly the right amount. The storm arrived 4 days later, not the note-in-the-wall storm that was still building. What arrived first was the precursor 48 hours of weather that was just the real storm clearing its throat. The temperature had dropped enough that the mud between the cabin and lean-to was hard as fired clay, and the stream had gone from a rush to a frozen lid of dirty gray ice over dark water. They were inside by then, had been inside for the better part of 2 days. Ellie was at the table with the casting equipment, which he'd been putting off because it required a sustained fire, a steady hand, and the kind of focused quiet that was harder to achieve now that the cabin had a second occupant. Not because Ada was loud, she was nearly never loud, but because her presence created a kind of atmospheric pressure that made it difficult to focus on things requiring the entire mind. He laid out the equipment with deliberate calm. The iron crucible on its trivet, the small bed of coals scooped from the stove into a steel tray, the brass bullet mold, the block of empty brass cartridge casings, the tin of black powder, the percussion caps in their small wax paper box. Ada was doing what she'd been doing for the past hour, pacing. There was no better word for it. Moving from the stove to the window to the trunk to the stove in a circuit that was wearing a groove between the floorboards, her arms crossed over her chest, her jaw working on something she wasn't saying. Sit down. He didn't look up from arranging the trivet. You're making the air nervous. I need something to do. I know you do. Then give me a task. He looked up at her then. The restless energy coming off her was almost visible like heat shimmer off summer rock, except it was November on a Colorado ridge, and there was nothing summery about it. She needed to be useful the way some people needed water. Idleness was a specific kind of suffering for her, not laziness, but its absolute opposite, a person built for motion being denied it. He kicked the small stool out from under the table with his boot. Sit, watch first. She sat. He pushed the brass bullet mold across the table toward her, then the block of cartridge casings, then the tin and the caps. She looked at each item in turn, taking inventory the way she took inventory of everything. You know what powder is. I know it explodes. Good. Respect it like it will because it will. He picked up the small brass measuring scoop, 1 level scoop into each casing. Level it with your thumbnail, not more, not less. Too much, the rifle blows apart in my hands. Too little, the bullet doesn't clear the barrel, and the next shot does the same thing. He set the scoop on the table. Understand what I'm telling you. She looked at the tin of powder, at the empty casings, at him. Her eyes had changed, the restless pacing energy had crystallized into something focused and absolutely still. This was not sweeping a floor. This was his life in her hands in a way that was very specific. And she understood that. I understand. She picked up the scoop. Her hand was entirely still, not the stillness of someone controlling a tremor, but the genuine stillness of a person who has located the exact center of a task and settled into it. She dipped the scoop, leveled it with her thumbnail, careful, precise, unhurried, tipped it over the first brass casing. The powder fell in with a soft, dry hiss. He watched her do it again and again. 10 casings in a row without spilling a single grain on the rough wood of the table. Without looking up for reassurance, he reached for the tongs and the crucible. clamped the iron handles, lifted the vessel over the bed of coals. The lead inside had been melting for 20 minutes and was now a liquid silver pool that moved like something alive, catching the red light of the coals in slow, hypnotic shifts. The heat radiating off it was intense, baking the skin of his face, narrowing his eyes to slits. He poured the liquid metal into the sprue hole of the iron mold. It went in with a sharp, aggressive hiss, a thin white thread of acrid smoke rising toward the ceiling. He counted in his head, set the mold down, let it cool. They worked like that for an hour, and it was nothing like the silence of the first days, which had been a wall. This was the silence of two people inside the same current, each doing their part of a single thing: the clinking of brass, the scrape of the mold hinge, the soft tap of the measuring scoop, the low hiss of each pour. Outside, the wind worked steadily on the sod roof, looking for the gaps it always found eventually, and the temperature was dropping in hourly steps, like a staircase going somewhere very cold. He struck the mold with the wooden mallet. The hinge popped. A perfect bullet dropped onto the leather pad, shining silver, still warm enough that a thin wisp of heat rose from it. He reached for the next empty casing, just as Ada leaned forward to set down a finished one. Their hands met in the middle of the table. Not a brush. A full collision of knuckles, clumsy and hard, the kind that happens when two people reach for the same space without coordinating. Ada pulled back, sharply gasped, and the edge of her wrist caught the side of the bullet mold sitting on the trivet. Not the mold itself, the trivet arm, still radiating heat from the coals below. He heard the sound she made, short, involuntary, and was around the end of the table before she could pull her arm against her chest. He caught her wrist, turned it over. A burn across the pale skin of her inner wrist, already going deep red, a blister beginning to form at the center. Nasty. The kind that would make sleep difficult for several nights and any pressure on that spot deeply unpleasant for longer. It's fine, she was already saying it. I'm fine. Eli, let go. Stop fighting me. He was already moving, keeping her wrist in his grip, walking her 3 steps to the water bucket by the door. The bucket had a skim of ice on top. He broke it with 2 fingers and plunged her wrist in without waiting for her to agree. She made a sound at the sudden cold, not controlled, not edited. Just the involuntary noise of a body registering something extreme, and then she was standing next to him with her shoulder against his arm and her wrist submerged, and her breathing coming fast and shallow, and neither of them was moving. He kept his hand around her forearm, not gripping, just present the way you keep your hand against a wall in the dark, not for the wall's sake. He looked down at her arm then, really looked in the dim afternoon light bleeding through the oiled paper. What 6 weeks on the ridge had written there. A thin scar along the index finger from the skinning knife, rough patches on the palm where blisters had formed and hardened into calluses, a scratch across the back of her hand from the woodpile. Soot worked deep into the creases of her knuckles from the stove grate, and now the burn, bright and angry, across the inner wrist. Your hands are a mess. He kept his voice flat. She looked down at them in the water. The cold was reddening her knuckles further, the burn site going from blazing to a duller, deeper ache. They're working hands now. A pause. That's what I came here to have. He looked at the side of her face. She was looking at the bucket. The water rippled around her submerged wrist in small, settling circles. Slowly, without announcing it, he loosened his grip on her forearm and let his fingers slide down to lightly trace the back of her wet knuckles. Deliberate. Not panicked, not accidental. Deliberate. The first touch in 6 weeks that had nothing to do with instruction or emergency. She looked up at him. The air in the cabin was doing something different. The smell of sulfur and hot lead had faded entirely. The stove was ticking. The wind was working on the north wall. And the distance between them, which had been carefully maintained, which had been the only reliable structure available in a 15 by 15 space, was gone. Had been going, he realized, for longer than just this moment. He lifted her wrist from the bucket. The water ran off her skin in cold streams. He reached back with his free hand for the strip of clean cotton drying on the line above the stove and brought it to her wrist, wrapping it, the tension just firm enough to hold without restricting, tucking the frayed end under itself so it wouldn't slip. He'd been shown this once, a long time ago, by a woman who had known what she was doing, Eli. Her voice was barely there, a thread pulled too thin. He looked up. She was standing inches from him. The pulse in the hollow of her throat was visible, a small, frantic jumping under the pale skin. She smelled like wood smoke and gunpowder and cold water, and underneath all of it, something that was just her, just Ada, that had nothing to do with what she'd been before she climbed off that stagecoach in Bitter Creek. She smelled like this cabin, like this air, like the ridge itself, which got into everything eventually and changed it from what it had been into what it was going to be. "I'm not sending you back on the stagecoach." The words came out harsh and absolute, from somewhere below consideration. "Whatever else happens." "That's decided," her breath caught. Her chest rose sharply under the dark wool. "Cord will send men when the pass clears. Even now. Practical. Planning ahead in the middle of everything else. He doesn't lose gracefully. Let him send them." His hands were still holding her wrist, and both of them had noticed, and neither of them was doing anything about it. It's a steep climb in spring mud. There are places on the north side of the ridge where a man can lose his footing a long way from anywhere that would help him. The gray eyes held something that wasn't soft and wasn't gentle and was entirely, specifically her, that flinty, exhausted, absolutely unbowed thing that had looked at Bitter Creek's worst mud on her worst day and not taken a single step backward. She reached up with her unbandaged hand and fisted it into the front of his canvas shirt. Not gently, the way she'd stripped the hide off the rabbit, with full commitment, with the understanding that half measures were more dangerous than none. He didn't need to close the distance. She had already closed it. The kiss was not gentle. Their teeth clicked together clumsily, and he tasted bitter coffee and iron and the mineral sharpness of cold water, and she tasted like all of those things mixed with something that made his hands move without asking his permission up her back, pulling her toward him until her feet left the floor and her fingers dug into the muscles of his shoulders like she was looking for something solid to anchor to. Fierce, inelegant, entirely unplanned. The kind of thing that happens when two people have been circling something for a long time and simultaneously stop circling. He set her back on her feet. Eventually, both of them breathing like they'd been running uphill. Her hair had come loose on one side. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the cabin felt like a different place than it had 10 minutes ago, not physically, not in any way a man could point to, but different the way places are different when something true has happened in them. "Your bread," he said. "It's going to overproof." She looked at the covered dough near the stove. Then she laughed. Not a polished sound. Surprised out of her, a little undignified, entirely real, and it changed her face into something younger. Something that had forgotten it knew how to do this and was suddenly remembering. He turned back to the bullet mold before she could see what that sound did to him. She rescued the bread. 2 days after the bread, 3 days after the burn, the north storm arrived in the middle of the night, and Eli had been expecting it. The pressure dropping like a stone had woken him at 2 in the morning, and then the wind, which was not the usual wind of the ridge but something else entirely. A sustained freight train roar that hit the north wall with enough force to shiver the logs in their chinking. Then the snow, driving sideways, hurling itself horizontally through any gap it could find. Within an hour, the interior temperature had dropped enough that Eli's breath came out in thick white clouds from where he lay on the floor. He worked the stove, fed it every 40 minutes. By 3, he was burning through the indoor reserve faster than he'd calculated. By dawn, the reserve was gone, and he was down to what he could bring in from the woodpile, which meant opening the door into a wall of horizontal white that stole the heat of the room in seconds. Between trips to the woodpile, he looked at the corner bed. Ada was still, a small shape under the bare pelt, pulled over her head the way she did when the cold came for her in the night. He had stopped resenting that she slept in the bed while he took the floor. He could not have articulated exactly when that had happened. Sometime around the 3rd week, at dawn, with the wind still screaming, he called her name. She didn't move. He crossed the room in 4 steps, pulled the bare pelt back from her face. What he saw stopped his breath entirely. Her face was the color of a coal fire at its peak, not the flushed pink of normal cold, but the brilliant wrong red of a body burning itself up from the inside. Her lips were cracked dry and white at the corners. Her breathing was audible from 2 feet away, a wet rattling sound that was not how lungs were supposed to sound. He dropped to his knees beside the bed. "Ada," too loud in the small room. "Ada, open your eyes." Her eyelids moved, heavy, reluctant. When they finally opened, her eyes were glassy, not the sharp gray that filed everything away, but clouded, unfocused, left, the eyes of someone looking at the world through bad water, cold, the word barely made it out. Dry as crumbled paper. It's so cold, Eli. His mind was already doing the inventory. How many days of fever, what the room temperature was, what was in the supply tin, willow bark, yarrow. The knowledge his mother had given him about fevers, about the narrow margin between a fever that breaks and one that doesn't. The distance to Bitter Creek completely irrelevant. The pass was closed. There was no doctor. There was only what was in this cabin and what he knew how to do. And underneath all of it, colder than the storm, he knew exactly why she was sick. The drafty chinking on the north wall he'd been meaning to repair since August. The hauling of half-frozen water in temperatures the body couldn't sustain without proper layering, which she hadn't had. The accumulated stress of 6 weeks under the weight of his constant, grinding suspicion, his deliberate coldness, the way he had looked at her the first 3 weeks, like she was an error he was being forced to live with. He had ground her down with the specific efficiency of a man who had wanted her to fail the audition, and her body had finally presented the bill for it. There was no satisfaction in that accounting. There was only a particular quality of terror he hadn't felt since he was 29 years old and kneeling beside another woman in another storm. He moved, kettle from the hook. Snow grabbed through the cracked door before the wind could steal the door entirely, onto the hottest part of the stove. While the water heated, he dug into the supply crate, pushed the coffee aside, lifted the flour bag and found the small canvas pouch of dried willow bark and the bundle of yarrow tied with a strip of rawhide. The water took 20 minutes to boil. 20 minutes of Ada's rattling, irregular breathing filling every corner of the room, louder than the storm somehow, louder than everything. He steeped the tea dark amber, smelling of something medicinal and bitter, poured it into a tin cup and went back to the bed. You have to sit up. He slid his arm under her shoulders and lifted. She weighed less than the moment demanded of her. She was running so hot he could feel it through his canvas shirt, as though she were an iron left too long on the coals. Her head fell back and came to rest against the hollow of his shoulder. Her hair was damp with fever sweat. The chestnut turned dark against her neck. He held the cup to her cracked lips. Drink this. Swallow it, Ada. The hot rim touched her mouth and something in her registered. She parted her lips and took a slow, painful sip. Then another. She didn't fight the bitterness. She drank half the cup before her head went entirely slack against his shoulder. Exhausted by the effort, he set the cup on the floor. He did not lay her back down. The mattress was pulling the heat directly out of her body through the quilts, and no amount of blankets on top was going to compensate for cold below. He shifted his weight, pulling the bare pelt up around them both, and held her back against his chest, and became very deliberately a furnace every degree his body was running above hers, transferred to her by the most direct route available. She was rigid at first, even now, even barely conscious. Something deep and installed, refusing the intimacy of it even when the body had no resources left to waste on pride. Then the warmth reached her, slowly. The way frost releases from a window as the morning sun moves across it, the stiffness leaving her muscles in increments. The set of her shoulders softening by degrees, the angle of her neck changing as the held weight finally let go. Her knees drew up toward her chest. She turned her face into the crook of his arm. Ellie sat with his back against the wall and listened to the storm try to take the roof off the cabin. He kept one hand spread between her shoulder blades, feeling every breath she took, counting the rhythm the way you monitor a fire in high wind, constant attention, prepared to act at the first change. The wet rattling sound in her chest was still there, but the frantic shivering had slowed as her muscles got warm. He rested his chin lightly against the top of her head. The anger he'd been carrying since October at the agency, at the situation, at the particular cruelty of the universe for sending him something he hadn't asked for and didn't know how to refuse it, cracked. Not in a dramatic way. The way river ice cracks in the first week of spring, one clean line. Suddenly, without warning, and then you can see the water moving underneath. He thought about what she'd said about her father, and sorry, and the words people use when they've run out of actions. He thought about how she'd sat at this table with flour on her wrists, and talked about a man who smelled of blood and hit his dogs as if she were reporting weather. And he thought about the fact that she was 23 years old, and had forged a magistrate's signature and crossed 1,000 miles of hard country, and walked into a cabin with a man who had done everything in his power to make her feel unwelcome, and she had not asked anyone to feel sorry for her for a single minute of it. "Don't quit," he said it into the tangled dark mass of her hair. "Not loud, barely above the wind. You don't get to quit now. Not after everything you've already done." She didn't answer. But after a while, the wet rattle in her breathing began very slightly, barely perceptibly to ease. The fever broke on the second night. Ely felt it happen, a shift in the quality of her heat, the desperate burning of it softening to something more ordinary. The sweat soaking through her dress and into the left shoulder of his shirt where her head had been resting for 16 hours. He hadn't moved. His right leg was completely numb below the knee. A cramp had locked down the left side of his neck. His lower back was filing a formal complaint that he was ignoring. He sat perfectly still. The storm had ended at some point in the previous night, not gradually but all at once, the howling replaced by a silence so complete it had physical weight. The cabin was cold, the stove having burned down to ash while he sat here, which he would address when he could stand without waking her. Ada stirred, a small sound in the back of her throat, dry and papery. Then she pulled the bare pelt tighter with fingers that were weak but working. Then her eyes opened, the clarity was back. Not completely ringed with bruised shadows, the glassy quality still in the corners of her vision, but the focus was there. The sharp grey intelligence that processed everything and gave nothing away until it was ready. She stared at his shirt for a moment, getting her bearings. Then she understood where she was, who was holding her. She stiffened immediately, involuntarily, that pride surfacing before anything else could, hands pushing weakly against his chest. "Don't." His voice was gravel from disuse and the long vigil. "You'll pull the cold in." She stopped pushing, let her hands rest flat against his shirt. Not relaxed, but staying. How long? Barely a whisper. 2 nights. Storm's done. He shifted carefully, peeling himself away from her by degrees, letting the cold air come in gradually rather than all at once. His numb leg hit the floor with a sensation somewhere between pain and nothing that took several seconds to resolve. He went to the stove, got the fire going from the remaining ash with pine shavings and patience, fed it until it caught with a smoky flare. When he turned back, Ada was watching him. She looked like someone who had been through a flood and was taking inventory of what remained. Cheekbones too sharp against skin that had gone from fever red to something almost translucent, lips still cracked, a small healing split at one corner of her mouth, her hair in absolute ruin, matted, damp with old sweat. He went to the larder without being asked, got the frozen rabbit haunch, hacked it into pieces, threw them in the pot with snow and salt. While it heated, he rebuilt the fire properly, got the room temperature back up to something livable, and brought her the first cup of clean coffee when it was ready, which took 40 minutes she spent in short intervals of sleep or watching him work with those slow, recovering eyes. She held the tin cup in both hands. Didn't speak for a while. I ruined the dress, looking down at the dark blue wool, stained now with old sweat and the faint rust shadow of the rabbit blood from the week before, a watermark across the hem from the spilled bucket. The left sleeve still had that unrepaired tear. "I'll heat water." "You can scrub it." She closed her eyes, let her head drop back against the pillow. "I don't want to scrub it." He waited. "I want to burn it." The corner of his mouth did something involuntary. He turned away and stirred the pot before she could see it. He brought her the broth when it was ready. She held the cup and drank it slowly, and the color coming back into her face was like watching something be restored, gradual, persuasive, incremental. When the cup was half empty, she looked at him over the rim. "The note you found," her voice was steadier now, still rough but working, "the one from Pratt. You've had it in your pocket for 12 days. A pause. "I found it when I was washing your coat after the first freeze. I put it back." He looked at her. "I know what it means." She said it without drama, just the facts laid out the way she laid everything out. "Whoever Pratt is, he was on the stagecoach with me. Round face, sample case, black notebook in his vest pocket. He looked at me too long and asked too many questions of the driver." She set the cup down. "He works for Cord." Ellie absorbed this. She had known for how long she'd been on the mountain. She had said nothing. She had spent the weeks since she found the note carrying the information the same way she carried everything else, quietly, waiting until she had enough to act. "We need to go down before the pass clears on Cord's End," she said. "Not wait for him to come up. When you're able to ride, I'll be able to ride in 3 days. 5. She looked like she was going to argue. She looked at the state of her own hands, which were still trembling slightly around the cup, and revised. 4. He almost said 3 again. He didn't. 4 agreed. She drank the rest of the broth. Let him take the cup. And then, before he stood up from the chair he'd pulled close to the bed, "Thank you for not leaving," he looked at her. "I don't mean the cabin." Quiet, direct. "I mean I heard you both nights. I don't think you knew I could hear." A pause. "Don't quit." "I heard that." He stood up, carried the cup to the table, stood at the larder door with his back to her for a long moment. Because some things that are true don't need anything added to them. Because the distance between who he'd been in October and who he was right now was the exact length of one terrible winter and one woman who had refused, with every resource she had, to be less than what she was. "Sleep," he said. "You're still half a fever." She slept. The 4 days of recovery had their own rhythm. Ada ate what he put in front of her without arguing about portions. She slept more than she was accustomed to and resented it visibly, but did not fight it. On the second day, she sat up and asked him to bring the ledger from the bottom of her trunk, a small book, battered brown cover. Her father's handwriting in careful columns, and she spent 2 hours reading through it with the focused attention she gave to problems that needed solving. Occasionally making small notes on the margin of a foolscap sheet with a stub of pencil she produced from somewhere in her skirt pocket. He did not ask what she was working on. He learned that if he waited, she would tell him. On the morning of the 3rd day, she got out of bed before he was up. He came out of a shallow sleep to find her standing at the stove in her underdress and shawl, the coffee already made correctly, the grounds in the linen bag, the water at the right temperature below a full boil. She handed him a cup without turning around, the gesture so natural it took him a moment to register that it was the first time it had happened. He sat. She sat across from him with her own cup and the ledger open on the table between them. "My father recorded every payment he made to Cord," she said. $1,200 over 3 years, in installments. Cord's claim is based on the full $4,000, which means he falsified his own records to erase what my father had already paid. She turned the ledger to face Eli. "If we can get this authenticated, Cord's legal position in any Colorado court collapses. He has no legitimate claim. The proxy I signed doesn't matter if the underlying debt it's based on is fraudulent." Ellie looked at the columns. The entries were precise dates, amounts, the name of the bank that handled the transfers. The handwriting was an older man's, careful and slightly formal, the handwriting of someone who had understood that records were the only reliable witness. "There's a man in Bitter Creek," Eli said. "Theodore Hendricks. He's been handling cattle disputes and land claims in this territory for 15 years. He doesn't take money from men like Cord. Cord tried to buy him twice that I know of, and both times Hendricks told him in public what he thought of the offer." Ada looked at him over the top of the ledger. "And there's a man in St. Louis named Weybridge. Thomas Weybridge, Missouri Mercantile Exchange." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Your father used him for his cotton accounts. Weybridge filed a claim against Cord's packing house 2 years ago over disputed delivery payments. The case was dismissed, but the filing is public record, and it would have required authenticated handwriting samples from everyone named in the contracts, including your father, as a co-signatory on 3 exchange agreements. Weybridge will have those samples on file." Ada stared at him. "I go to the telegraph office in Bitter Creek once a month for supply orders. I read the legal notices from the state while I'm there." He met her eyes. "It's something I do." A silence. She was doing something complicated with her expression, the effort of not letting something escape onto her face. "Eli, Ada, you are," she said, with the careful precision of someone choosing their words, "a deeply strange person. The authenticated samples match what's in that ledger," he said. "Weybridge can provide attestation by telegraph. Hendricks can file on the fraudulent balance before Cord's Denver lawyer knows we've moved." She looked at the ledger, then at him. Then she closed it and set it on the table between them like something that had just been decided. "We go down as soon as I can ride. 4 days. You said 4? She picked up her coffee cup. "I said 4. I meant it." On the afternoon of the 4th day, she came outside for the first time since the fever. The air was sharp and clean, the sky a hard, brilliant blue over the granite face of the ridge. She stood on the crude porch with her face tilted up, eyes closed, taking in the cold sunlight the way a person takes in something they'd been worried about losing. He watched her from the woodpile. He had been watching her the whole time she'd been sick with the specific watchfulness of a man who has learned what it costs to look away, and he saw no reason to stop now that she was better. She opened her eyes and found him looking. She did not look away. "I need you to teach me to shoot," she said. "Before we go down," she said it, the way she said everything that mattered directly, without softener, as a statement of what was going to happen rather than a request for permission. "There's an extra Colt in the box under the bed. I've seen you clean it." He looked at her. At the scar on her index finger, the rough patches on her palms, the red line still healing on her wrist from the mold burn. "We start tomorrow," he said. "When the light's good." She nodded. Once. The particular nod of a person who has already moved past the answer and is now thinking about the work. Then, "I want to tell you something. Let me finish before you say anything." He waited. "I was not running only from cord." She looked at the valley below the ridge, visible now through the stripped winter trees, the road to Bitter Creek, a thin brown line in the distance. "I was also running from the version of myself that was going to agree to it. That was going to stand in a parlor in a dress I hated and tell myself it was practical. That version of myself was losing ground every day I stayed in St. Louis." She paused. "I found your advertisement at 7 in the morning, standing at the agency desk in a coat I was going to have to return by the end of the week because we couldn't afford the bill. And I thought a man who needs a workhorse, a mountain that will probably try to kill me, and I thought that is still a better choice than becoming something Cord puts in a frame and hangs on his wall." She looked back at him. "So that is also why I'm here. Not only the debt, that too." The cold air moved between them. The stream below the lean-to was talking to itself, the ice thinning at the edges, the water finding its way through. "Ruth wanted a choice too," Eli said, quietly, the way he said things he'd thought about for a long time without saying them. "She wanted to come up here. Everyone told her not to. I told her not to when I was trying to be honest with her. She said the mountain or nothing." He turned the axe handle in his hands. "I never once thought she was wrong to choose the mountain. I only thought I hadn't built it solid enough to deserve what she chose." Ada looked at him with those gray eyes that had stopped being readable weeks ago, not because they'd closed but because he'd stopped having a framework for what he was seeing in them. "You built it solid enough," she said, flat, factual, the voice she used for things she was certain of. "I'm here." He picked up the axe and split the next round of cedar. She went back inside to rebuild the fire and start the bread. That night he went out to the back of the lean-to before he came inside. Stood there beside the small cross in the ground, 2 planks, the vertical one slightly crooked because he'd driven it into frozen earth and hadn't fixed it in the spring, and then hadn't been able to bring himself to touch it. The evening air was still. No wind for once. The first stars were showing above the granite face of the ridge. He stood there for a while. Then he went back inside, where the lamp was lit and the bread was rising on the shelf above the stove, and Ada was at the table with the ledger open and her pencil moving, preparing the case they were going to need. He sat down across from her, picked up the supply tally he'd been working through, and they sat like that until the lamp burned low, each doing the work the next few weeks were going to require, and the silence between them was the kind that has stopped needing to justify itself. The shooting lessons started the morning after the conversation about the ledger, in the particular cold gray light of early March that came through the oiled paper windows like weak tea strained twice. Ely dug the spare Colt from the box under the bed. Single action army. 7.5-inch barrel, worn walnut grips smoothed by a previous owner before he'd acquired it in trade 3 years back. He checked the cylinder out of habit empty, as he always kept it stored, handed it across the table. Ada held it with both hands, assessing the weight, not performing caution, actually calculating it. Heavy, not a complaint. Data, 7.5 pounds of steel. Heavier after you've held it at arm's length for 10 minutes. He pulled his coat off the peg. Outside, they went around to the back of the lean-to, where the granite face of the ridge gave them a backstop and where the sound wouldn't carry far enough to matter. Eli set 3 pine cones on the split log fence rail at 20 feet. Ada stood with the gun at her side, watching him place them. Thumb the hammer back first. It won't fire until you do. He stepped back and slightly to her left. 2 hands. Right hand grips, left hand supports. Right elbow lines up with your shoulder level with it, not above. Sight down the barrel. The front sight sits in the notch of the rear. She raised the gun, adjusted her stance without being told, feet apart. weight slightly forward, the same posture she'd figured out for hauling water without throwing out her back. He'd noticed that about her from the first week. She applied lessons across categories, learned something in her spine, not just in her hands. Squeeze. Don't pull the colt off with a crack that bounced off the granite face and came back at them. The left pine cone exploded into fragments. She looked at the remaining two on the rail, then at him, something working in her expression, not pride, more like the specific satisfaction of a person who has correctly predicted how a mechanism operates. Again, she said, she missed the next three. The recoil surprised her on the second shot. She'd been compensating incorrectly, and it sent the barrel high. He corrected her grip without touching the gun, describing it. Thumb here, not there. Heel of your hand lower. Stop bracing for the sound before it comes, because bracing changes your squeeze. She adjusted. Shot again. Hit the rail an inch from the second pine cone, close enough that it rocked. You're flinching at the trigger brake. I know. I can feel it happening. I can't stop it yet. Yet, he noted the word. Filed it the way she filed things. They did this every morning for 2 weeks. First 20 feet, then 30, then 40, which was the realistic range for the kind of situation that wasn't a formal duel but rather the disordered, close quarters. Everything happening at onst kind that was the only kind that actually happened. Her shoulder bruised from the recoil and she never mentioned it, but he saw the way she held it at a certain angle when she thought he wasn't watching, and he added dried willow bark to her evening tea without explaining why. She shot until she hit what she aimed at more often than not. She shot until the flinch was gone and the motion of drawing and cocking and squaring her stance lived in her muscles instead of her mind. She loaded and unloaded and loaded again until she could do it in the dark, which she practiced twice, standing outside in the moonless cold with the cylinder in her hands and her eyes closed. He watched her do that, standing in the frozen dark behind the lean-to with the gun she'd loaded by feel, and felt something in his chest that he would not have had words for in October, and still didn't have words for now, but no longer needed them. The thaw came in the third week of March, the way it always came in Colorado high country. Not gradually. All at once and with violence, the ridge groaning under the shift of accumulated ice, the stream behind the lean-to swelling overnight from a frozen seam to a roaring brown current that threatened the timber footing of the lean-to's east wall. The air went heavy and wet, smelling aggressively of pine sap coming awake and the raw green smell of things pushing up through thawed ground. Mud returned, thick and sucking and indifferent to whatever anyone had planned. Eli was at the chopping block splitting cedar when Ada came out of the cabin. She'd been working on the gray trade blanket for a week, measuring, cutting, hemming with the small silver needle in the evenings by lamplight, and she was wearing what she'd made from it now. A heavy skirt hemmed just above her boot tops to stay clear of the worst of the muck. Over her faded blouse, his old leather vest, cinched at the waist with a length of braided rawhide she'd cut from the repair coil on the wall peg. Her hair was in a single thick practical braid down her spine, the loose chest strands at her temples caught by the March wind. She picked up both water buckets without a word and walked to the edge of the porch. Didn't pause at the step, came down directly into the ankle-deep mud boots, making the deep, sucking sound of weight committing, and moved to the swollen stream in a straight line. No hesitation, no accounting for the cold or the mud or the noise of the water. She hauled the full buckets back up the incline without slowing. Set them on the porch, felt him watching, turned. He leaned on the axe handle and looked at her in the full March light, which was thin still but honest, and did not bother to disguise what he was doing. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked at him with those gray eyes that had been reading him since October. "You going to split that cedar?" she called across the mud and the roar of the stream, "or stand there until the wood splits itself?" He pulled the axe free and brought it down. He felt for the first time in 5 years that the weight he'd been carrying was not gone. He did not expect it to be gone, had made his peace with the fact that some things you carry always, only differently as time moves, but it was one weight among several now. Shared weight, which was a different thing entirely from weight that had no one on the other end of it. She came to stand beside him while he worked, not helping, not hovering, just present in the way she was present when something mattered to her. Looking out over the valley, where the mud and the melt and the distant thin line of the road to Bitter Creek were becoming visible again for the first time since October. The pass will be open in a week, quiet, measuring the distance with her eyes, maybe less if this warm holds. A pause. The stream roared behind the lean-to. Cord will have been watching the weather reports from St. Louis, not afraid. Precise. A woman reviewing the field before moving on to it. He'll know the pass timing as well as we do. Ellie set the axe in the stump. Then we go down before he comes up. She nodded once. Looked at the valley for another moment. Then went inside to start the bread, which she made now without thinking, the folding and the timing and the judgment of heat coming from her hands rather than from having to stop and reason it out. That evening Eli cooked without occasion or excuse. He had stopped pretending there was a reason needed. He took from the larder a venison roast, the last of the dried huckleberries from the summer's putting up, the wild honey he'd taken from a tree cavity on the north slope in August, dried onion, thyme, a spoonful of good tallow. He built the sauce slowly, stock reduced over low heat, the berries added near the end. The honey stirred in last until the whole thing went dark and fragrant and entirely out of proportion to what a man alone on a ridge had any business producing. Ada came in from the evening shooting practice. She ran herself through drills now without instruction, reversing the distance sequence because she'd determined that close range required a different quality of aim than distance, and she wanted ease in both, and stopped in the doorway when the smell reached her. "What's the occasion?" "None." She looked at the arrangement of pots and the careful attention of it and decided not to pursue the question further. She hung the colt on her wall peg and washed her hands at the basin and sat down. He plated the food. She ate the first bite and closed her eyes for one involuntary second, the honest, unperformed kind, and then opened them and looked at her plate, and then at him. "Your mother's recipe." He kept his voice even. "The sauce. She made it with elk when we had it." "Venison takes longer to come right." Ada looked at him across the table. "She would have been worth knowing," she said. The same words he'd used about her father's character weeks ago returned now with precision. He recognized them and she knew he would, and that was why she'd chosen them. He ate. She ate. The lamp between them was steady, and the stove was doing its job, and outside the mud was deepening with the melt, and somewhere down the mountain, the road to Bitter Creek was opening up like a sentence that had been left unfinished all winter. "I've been thinking about what Hendricks will need." She cut a piece of meat with the focused attention she gave every physical task. "The ledger entries are clear for the payments my father made, but Cord's lawyer will challenge the authenticity. We need someone who knew my father's handwriting independently." "Weybridge at the Missouri Mercantile Exchange," Eli said. "Authenticated samples from your father's co-signatures on the exchange contracts." Hendricks telegraphs Weybridge. Weybridge confirms. Hendricks files on the fraudulent balance before Cord's Denver lawyer knows we've moved. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. 2 days to establish if Weybridge responds promptly. Longer if he doesn't. Ada nodded, taking the information, building it into the plan she'd been constructing since the fever broke. "And the proxy I signed invalid, which is why we need the fraudulent debt to be the issue, not the proxy. If the debt collapses, everything Cord built on it collapses with it." She was quiet for a moment, the plan running in her head. Then, "When Cord arrives, and he will arrive, because men like him don't accept the telegraph when they can make a scene in person, I need to be the one who speaks. Not you on my behalf." He looked at her. "I need to be the one who faces him," she said, steady, without apology, in front of whoever is watching. "That matters." He held her gaze for a moment. "Then, I'll be standing next to you, I know." She looked at her plate. "That's what I need. Not in front. Next to." He nodded once. They understood each other. After supper she got the ledger out, and they went through it together at the table, him reading the column headers aloud, her translating her father's abbreviated notations into plain language that would hold up to a lawyer's scrutiny. The lamp was between them and their heads were close above the open pages, and neither of them acknowledged it, and both of them were aware of it, which was exactly where they'd arrived, and neither of them intended to back away from. They left at first light 5 days later, Beck and Cora on the buckboard, the pass mud deep but navigable, the sky a clear cold blue with no weather building to the north. Ada had the ledger in the saddlebag on the right side of the wagon seat. The Colt was on her hip under the leather vest, hammer down, cylinder loaded. She'd loaded it herself the night before, while Ely cleaned the rifle, and neither of them had commented on the parallel. He drove. She sat beside him with her spine upright, and her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes on the road going down the same road she had come up in October, stiff with cold and shivering under a horse blanket, with no clear idea of what she was coming up to. She looked at it now the way she looked at most things. Measuring the difference between then and the woman making this descent, Bitter Creek was loud with early spring. The mud was back in force, the familiar muck of the trading post town coming alive, after winter horses tied outside the saloon, a freight wagon being unloaded in front of the dry goods store, two men arguing about fence line at the far end of the main street, the telegraph station with its door propped open for the first time since November. They pulled up at the rail in front of Hendrix's office, a narrow wood-frame building between the barber and the telegraph station. A shingle outside reading T. Hendrix, attorney at law Est. 1869. Eli wrapped the reins. Ada was on the ground by the time he came around. Bay Hargrove from the dry goods store had come out onto her porch. She had the particular stillness of a woman who has been the primary information exchange of a small town for 15 years, and knows how to observe without appearing to. She looked at Eli Crane, who came down before May only when he had specific business, and never with company, and then at the woman beside him in the trail-worn leather vest and the blanket cloth skirt, the heavy braid over one shoulder, the colt on her hip under the vest's bottom edge. Mr. Crane. B's voice was even. "I heard you'd taken a wife." Eli put his hand briefly on Ada's shoulder. "B, this is Ada." He said it the way he said facts that didn't require elaboration. Just the name. Like a thing the world needed to organize itself around, Ada looked at Bea Hargrove directly. Not performing anything, not asking for anything, just meeting the older woman's assessment with her own. Bea Hargrove looked at Ada for a long moment, the full measure, unhurried, and then nodded once, slowly. The particular nod of a woman who has decided something and doesn't need to announce what it is. "There's a man at the hotel," Bea said, her voice dropping a register. "Arrived 2 days ago. Round fellow sample case, black notebook he keeps in his vest pocket." Ada's hand moved to the ledger satchel. Small, controlled, Ellie looked at Bea. "He talked to anyone?" "He talked to everyone. Asked about your cabin, your road, whether you'd been seen since the snow closed." A pause. "I told him I hadn't laid eyes on you since October." Which was the truth. Something shifted in Ada's posture, not relief. Which would have been premature, more like the adjustment of a chess player who has noted the position of a key piece and updated her calculations accordingly. They went into Hendrix's office. Theodore Hendrix was 60 years old, built close to the ground, with a full head of white hair, and the eyes of a man who had seen every variety of human dishonesty that Colorado territory could produce and had stopped being surprised by any of it around 1872. He looked at the two of them, at the ledger Ada set on his desk, at Eli's expression, which Hendrix apparently knew well enough to read despite its limited range. "Sit down," Hendrix said. "Tell me," Ada told him. She laid it out the way she'd laid it out at the table in the cabin, clean, sequential, no embellishment, the numbers exact, cord. The debt, the falsified balance, the forged proxy, the original ledger payments in her father's hand. Weybridge at the Missouri Mercantile Exchange. She spoke for 8 minutes without interruption. She did not look at Eli once while she spoke. Hendrix read through the ledger without interrupting, turned pages, made notes on foolscap in a cramped, precise hand, set the ledger down and laced his fingers together. "Cord will have filed an amended claim in Jackson County based on abandonment and an invalid proxy," he said. "His Denver lawyer is good. I know him. He'll file quickly and he'll file completely." "The proxy is invalid," Ada said. "I forged the magistrate's signature." "I'm aware. I just told a lawyer that." Hendrix looked at her over the top of the ledger. "The proxy doesn't matter if the debt it's based on is fraudulent. If Cord falsified the balance, every legal instrument he built on that number falls with it." Her voice was entirely level. The voice of someone who has rebuilt this argument from the foundation up, many times, in the dark, until it holds under any pressure. "Weybridge has authenticated handwriting samples for my father as co-signatory on 3 exchange contracts. Those samples match what's in that ledger. Weybridge will provide attestation by telegraph within 48 hours if you contact him today." Hendrix picked up his pen. "And if Cord challenges the attestation, then he challenges it in a Colorado court, not a Missouri one, which puts him outside the jurisdiction of the 3 judges he controls." She paused one beat. "He knows that. His Denver lawyer knows that. Which is why Cord will try to resolve this outside of a filing if he can." Hendrik set the pen down and looked at her for a moment that was longer than professionally necessary. "How long have you been working on this?" "Since November," Ada said. "I had time." Hendricks made a sound that was not quite a laugh and turned to his telegraph form. "I'll have the wire to Weybridge out before noon. 2 days for response barring weather." He looked up at Eli. "In the meantime, I'd suggest you both stay visible and accessible in Bitter Creek. If Cord arrives before the attestation comes back, I want to be able to reach you quickly." Ellie looked at Bea Hargrove's dry goods store through the window. At the hotel across the street where Lyle Pratt was presumably watching the same window from the other direction. At the freight wagon still being unloaded, the fence line argument still unresolved. The ordinary machinery of a small town in early spring running without knowledge of what was assembling itself in a lawyer's office. "We'll be at the livery," Eli said. They were loading the last of the supply purchases onto the buckboard 2 hours later when Virgil Cord came around the corner of the livery, not alone. Lyle Pratt behind him with his sample case and his black notebook, and behind Pratt a third man wide-shouldered, dust on his coat from a long ride, the kind of man whose value to his employer was entirely physical and who made no attempt to conceal this. Cord was not what the sum of Ada's descriptions had prepared Eli to see, and was simultaneously exactly that. Broad, well-dressed, the pocket watch catching the afternoon light. The red face of someone who had been told yes for a long time by people who needed something from him. He moved like a man to whom the word no was a kind of weather, something unpleasant that happened to other people, manageable with the right preparations. He looked at Ada the way Ada had described, not like a person. Like an inventory item that had gotten out of its storage location. Eleanor. His voice was the practiced pleasant of a man who had learned that pleasant was more efficient than loud, most of the time. This has gone on long enough. Ada didn't move. She had stopped moving backward in November, and she was not going to start again on a muddy street in Bitter Creek in March with the whole town watching. "My name is Ada Crane." She said it the way she said things she had already decided, and it has gone on exactly as long as it needed to. Cord looked at Eli, the assessing look of a man calculating what an obstacle will cost him to move. "Crane." He said the name like a remark. "She's operating under a fraudulent proxy. Jackson County has filed. Hendricks already has the telegraph out to Weybridge at the Missouri Mercantile Exchange." Eli's voice came from somewhere level and unhurried. "Your father's ledger shows $1,200 in payments, your client's records erased. Whatever legal instrument Cord built on the falsified balance, Hendricks will have it unwound before the end of the week. You can ask your Denver lawyer what that means for the rest of his filing." Cord's pleasant quality thinned at the edges. Not gone, he was too practiced for that, but strained. He looked back at Ada, and the look changed. Became something with less calculation in it, and more of the thing underneath the calculation, the thing Ada had looked through a window and seen and decided she would not be in the same house with. "You made a fool of me, Eleanor. Quiet now. The quietness of something that has stopped performing. That has a cost that lives separately from any debt." He nodded once, a small, controlled motion toward the wide-shouldered man behind Pratt. The man moved. Not at Eli, around. The specific displacement of someone repositioning to create geometry to get between the buckboard and the street, to close the exit, to make the arithmetic of the situation come out a particular way. Ada drew clean. No hesitation. No announcement. The Colt up and level, hammer back, the long barrel absolutely still at the end of her right arm. Left hand at the grip, the way Eli had described and she had built into muscle over 2 weeks of morning drills. The way she had practiced in the dark with her eyes closed until it lived in her body and not in her thinking. She was not pointing it at Cord. She was pointing it at the wide-shouldered man who had been moving to cut off the exit. "Whatever you're reaching for." Her voice was flat. The same voice she used for the temperature of coffee water and the depth of the first knife cut on a rabbit hide the voice of someone stating observable conditions. "Take your hand away from it now." The man's hand stopped moving, because the hand is connected to a brain, and the brain was doing what brains do. It was looking at a woman in a blanket cloth skirt and a trail-worn leather vest with a Colt she clearly knew how to use, and it was running the calculation. And the calculation was not resolving in a way the wide-shouldered man found comfortable. The hand came out empty. Cord looked at the gun, at Ada, at Eli, who was standing 2 steps to Ada's left, not in front of her, not managing her, exactly where he'd said he would be. At the street around them, B. Hargrove in the doorway of the dry goods store with her arms crossed, Guthrie the barber on his step with a towel in his hands and his mouth slightly open, the freight wagon men who had stopped unloading, the two fence line arguers who had located something significantly more interesting than their fence line, and Hendricks, who had come out of his office and was standing on his narrow porch with the telegraph form still in his hand, watching all of Bitter Creek's working population on a Tuesday afternoon in March. All of them watching Virgil Cord stand in the mud of the main street while a woman with a colt held the situation in her hand. Cord was a man who understood the weight of witnesses. He had built his operation on witnesses, the right people in the right rooms at the right moment, the social mathematics of who saw what and what conclusions they drew. He knew, looking at this street, that whatever he did in the next 30 seconds was going to be known throughout this territory within the week. And the version of it currently visible, a woman in trail clothes with a steady hand, while the man behind the expensive coat had his hired muscle, standing with an empty palm, was not a version he could spend anywhere useful. He looked at Ada for a long moment. The calculation running, the pleasant quality entirely gone now, replaced by the thing underneath it, which was the face of a man who has found a limit he didn't know was there. He looked at her ledger satchel on the wagon seat, at the colt she had not lowered, at Eli standing next to her, not in front, not as a barrier, but as a fact of the landscape, the way the ridge was a fact, something that had simply decided to be where it was and was not going to be persuaded otherwise. This will be resolved through proper channels, Cord said. Each word placed carefully, the way a man places his feet on uncertain ground. He was speaking for Hendricks now, for Bea Hargrove, for the freight men and the barber and everyone on this street who was going to carry this story forward. My lawyer will be in contact. Hendricks will be expecting him, Ada said. She did not lower the colt until Cord had taken 3 full steps back toward the livery. Then she decocted smooth, controlled, the motion of someone who has done this enough times that it requires no thought, and holstered it at her hip without looking down. Pratt followed Cord. The wide-shouldered man followed Pratt. 3 horses came out of the livery, were mounted, moved south at a pace that communicated the end of a line of thinking rather than a retreat from one. The street let out a breath. Bea Hargrove uncrossed her arms and went back into her store, but she left the door open, which was how she continued to observe things she intended to keep observing. Guthrie the barber sat down on his step and shook his head once the slow, private shake of a man processing a story he's going to be telling for years. Hendricks stepped down from his porch and crossed the mud toward them with the telegraph form in his hand. He looked at Ada, at the holstered colt, at Eli. He said nothing for a moment, then, the wire to Weybridge goes out in 20 minutes. Come inside when you're ready, there's something else we need to address. Inside Hendricks's office, the afternoon light had gone the color of old brass. The stove in the corner was doing its best against the chill that came through the single window every time the door opened, which was twice while they sat once for Guthrie, who found he needed something notarized at an unusual hour, and once for the woman from the hotel who turned out to have no legal business at all and retreated after a good look at Ada's face. Hendricks let them settle. He was not a man who rushed the next thing. The telegraph to Weybridge is sent, he said. 2 days for response if St. Louis is cooperative. In the meantime, Cord's Denver lawyer will file a response to my preliminary challenge, which I expect by Thursday. He set his pen on the blotter. But there is the matter of the proxy. Ada looked at him steadily. The proxy you signed in St. Louis carried a forged magistrate signature, which makes it legally void in this territory and every other one. He looked at her without judgment, the eyes of a man who had seen everything and had left judgment behind somewhere around 1874, which means your current legal status as a married woman is, he paused, ambiguous. It's not ambiguous, Ada said. Hendricks looked at her. The proxy was void from the day I signed it. I knew that. She met his eyes. I also knew that a void proxy was still enough to get me on a stagecoach headed away from St. Louis before Cord could file an injunction. And once I was on that stagecoach, the question of whether the paper was valid became considerably less urgent than the question of whether I survived the winter. She let that sit for a moment. The proxy served its purpose. I don't need it anymore. Hendricks looked at Eli. Eli looked at Ada. At the side of her face in the old brass afternoon light, the sharp line of her jaw, the particular quality of stillness she had when she was waiting for events to arrive at the place she'd already calculated they were going. He thought about the cross behind the lean-to and what it had cost him to build it and what it had cost him to leave it standing instead of pulling it down. He thought about a woman who had looked at the worst available choice and picked it with both eyes open because at least it was her choice. "What does she need to sign?" he said. Hendricks pulled a form from the second drawer. "A legal marriage certificate, properly witnessed, filed with the county. It supersedes the proxy entirely. Whatever Cord's Denver lawyer tries to build on the void document, this makes the argument irrelevant." He looked between the two of them. "If that's what you both want." Ada turned and looked at Eli fully. The gray eyes doing what they always did, reading, filing, deciding. He had come to understand that when she looked at him like that, she was not performing consideration. She had already considered. She was checking her own conclusion against his face. He held her gaze. "Is it what you want?" She looked at him for one moment longer than the question required. "You know what I want. Say it anyway." The corner of her mouth moved. The hard-won thing, the one that cost her something every time. "I want this to be legal and real and done," she said. "And I want to go back up that mountain." Hendricks opened the office door and called across to the dry goods store. Bea Hargrove came over immediately, which suggested she had been expecting to be called. Guthrie the barber arrived 2 minutes later, with the unhurried air of a man who had been waiting in the general vicinity for no particular reason. It was not a ceremony in any recognizable sense. No flowers, no music, no church, no carefully chosen words. Just a table covered in legal documents, 2 witnesses recruited from adjacent businesses, and the particular quality of late afternoon light in a lawyer's office in a trading post town, where the mud outside was still deep from the snowmelt and the stove was still fighting the chill through the window. Ada signed with her own name, Ada Marsh. Then, below it, Ada Marsh Crane. Ellie signed where Hendricks pointed. His handwriting was large and functional, the handwriting of a man who had not spent much of his life at desks and was not apologetic about this. Bea Hargrove witnessed it with a small smile she did not attempt to conceal. Guthrie witnessed it with the expression of a man who would be describing this afternoon to his wife in considerable detail. Hendricks blotted the signatures, set the papers in his file box. "I'll have the fraudulent balance challenge filed before Cord's Denver lawyer can respond. With Weybridge's attestation, I expect this resolved in your favor within 2 weeks." He looked at them over his reading glasses. "Cord won't stop being who he is. But who he is can't reach you in Colorado territory on the basis of a debt that no longer holds up." He offered his hand to Eli. Eli shook it. He offered his hand to Ada. Ada shook it, which made him blink once, not in offense, in something closer to approval. "Congratulations," he said, as if he'd just remembered it was appropriate. They went out onto the main street of Bitter Creek. The mud was doing what mud did. The freight wagon had finished unloading. The fence line argument had apparently resolved itself or moved somewhere else. The ordinary machinery of the town running in early spring, without knowledge of what had just been settled in the narrow office between the barber and the telegraph station. Ada stood on the boardwalk and looked at the street. He stood beside her. Beck and Cora were at the rail, patient and resentful in equal measure, the loaded buckboard behind them. "That went more cleanly than I planned for," she said. "Cord leaving or Hendricks's filing, both. I had contingencies for considerably more resistance. You were ready for it either way." She looked at the Colt on her hip, at the ledger satchel in her hand, at the mud on her boots, which was the same mud that had soaked through her dress hem on the day she arrived. Except then she had not looked down at it, and she still didn't look down at it now. Not for all of it, quietly, honest in the way she was always honest, when it cost her something. "I wasn't ready for you to be standing next to me. I had planned for standing there alone." He looked at her profile against the spring street. At the braid over her shoulder and the line of her jaw and the gray eyes that had been reading him since October and had apparently found whatever they were looking for. "You could stand alone," he said. "You've proved it every way there is, but you don't have to anymore." He paused. The next part he was not going to dress up. "That's the whole thing I'm saying." She turned and looked at him. The sun was past the hotel roof, catching the side of her face at the angle that made the gray of her eyes go lighter at the center. She was 23 years old, and she had crossed 1,000 miles of hard country on a forged document and survived a fever that should have gone the other way and rebuilt her father's legal case from memory in a cabin without adequate insulation, and had just stood on the main street of Bitter Creek with a Colt and not moved backward. "I don't want to," she said. Just that they loaded the last of the supplies. Beck and Cora moved out from the livery rail. The road up to the ridge was 3 hours and steep in the spring mud, and neither of them had any illusions about the buckboard being comfortable. Eli drove with the reins loose. Ada sat beside him with the ledger in her lap, and her hands folded over it, and her face turned toward the country coming up around them, the pines, the granite, the specific vertical fact of the high ridge against the blue sky of a Colorado April. The town fell away behind them. The road climbed into the Douglas fir, and the air went clean. Eli. He waited. "Do you actually like it here?" She turned and looked at him, and there was something lighter in it than her usual questions, the beginning of something that was not quite amusement and not quite ease, but was in the neighborhood of both. The ridge. The cabin. The particular misery of November through February. "Did you choose it, or did it happen to you?" He thought about it. "I came up here after Ruth. Needed somewhere that required all of me, no room left over for anything else." He kept his eyes on the road. "I thought that was the point. Turns out it was just what worked at the time." A pause. The mules picked their way through a section of road where the snowmelt had carved ruts deep enough to swallow a wheel, and now he looked at her. At the braided hair and the borrowed vest and the eyes that had stopped being unreadable somewhere in November. "Now I like it because someone else is on it with me." She looked at the road ahead, took that in, let it settle the way she let everything settle fully, without rushing it toward a conclusion. The corner of her mouth did the thing it did. She let it show. They rode the rest of the way up in the particular silence of two people who have arrived somewhere and know it, the mules working the switchbacks with their usual resentful competence. The air getting sharper and cleaner with every 100 feet of elevation, the valley below shrinking to a brown line at the edge of the world. When the cabin came into view above the tree line, Ada looked at it, the low sod roof, the oiled paper windows catching the last of the afternoon light, the woodpile still shoulder-high against the north wall from the winter's cutting, and she did not see punishment. He could tell by the way she looked at it that she had not seen punishment in it for a long time. He stopped the mules. In the silence after the wagon settled, the stream behind the lean-to was a steady sound, bigger now with the melt, running clear and fast. The pines below the ridge were putting out the first small flags of new growth at their tips, the specific pale green of things coming back after a hard season. "We're home," he said. She turned and looked at him when he said that word. Checking, the way she always checked, not doubting but confirming. Making sure the word meant what she thought it did. It did. They unloaded the buckboard. She carried the ledger satchel inside and set it on the table, and then came back out to help with the supplies, passing him in the doorway twice the way they passed each other in the 15 by 15 space, aware, adjusted, no longer careful about it. That evening he went out to the back of the lean-to before supper. The ground behind it was soft now for the first time since autumn, the frost finally out of the top foot of soil. The small cross stood where it had always stood, the vertical plank still slightly crooked, because he'd never been able to bring himself to straighten it, and he wasn't going to straighten it now. Some things you left the way they were made. He stood there for a while. The evening was still, no wind for once, the kind of stillness that felt deliberate rather than accidental, the mountain deciding to hold its breath for a moment. The first stars were showing above the granite face. "We're going to be all right," he said. Not loud, meant for no one and for both of them at once. "All of us," the ridge said nothing. It never did, it was just there, vertical and permanent. The way it had been before any of them arrived and would go on being after. He found he didn't need it to answer. He went back inside. 4 weeks after Bitter Creek had the specific quality of something being built rather than endured. The spring thaw created work in multiples, the stream threatening the lean-to's east footing, the mud claiming the path to the woodpile every morning, the cabins chinking, needing repairs in 6 places where the winter had found weaknesses in the horsehair mix. They worked through it the way they had worked through everything, each carrying their portion, neither waiting to be assigned. Hendricks sent word on the 8th day. Weybridge had provided the authenticated samples. The fraudulent balance challenge had been filed. Cord's Denver lawyer had responded with a counter-filing that Hendricks had answered the same afternoon. On the 12th day, a second telegraph arrived. Cord had withdrawn the Jackson County claim. No explanation offered. Men like Cord didn't give explanations. They simply redirected toward ground that was more likely to hold. The withdrawal was on file. Hendricks had a copy, and there were no more folded papers wedged into the gaps between the cabin logs. Ada found new things to master. The elk jerky she made twice before the salt ratio came right, and Eli ate the first batch without comment, which she later told him was the most diplomatic thing she'd ever witnessed him do. The chinking repair, which she turned out to be better at than he was, because her hands were small enough to work the mud properly into the shallow gaps. The vocabulary of the ridge in spring, which sounds were weather, and which were animals, and which were ice shifting on the north slope in the afternoon warmth. She was teaching herself to read the sky. He watched her doing it, standing at the edge of the crude porch in the mornings, with her coffee and her eyes on the clouds, building the taxonomy from observation the way she built everything from the ground up, without shortcuts. One morning in the first week of May, she said, without turning around, "Storm building to the northwest, the flat-bottomed ones." By tomorrow morning, he came to stand beside her, looked at the clouds she was looking at. "To tomorrow morning," he agreed. "The flat bottom means the moisture is still high in the column. The ones that mean tonight have a dark underside precipitation already falling somewhere up there and not reaching the ground yet." He pointed to the western horizon. "See the difference?" She studied both, filed the distinction. "Tomorrow morning," she said again. Confirmed, he went back to the woodpile. She stayed at the porch with her coffee and the sky for another 10 minutes. And when she came inside, she sat down with a sheet of foolscap and wrote something she folded and put in the trunk. He didn't ask what it was. He understood the need to put the most important things into a form that couldn't be taken back. The storm came the next morning as predicted. Not severe, an hour of hard rain and then clearing, the ridge dripping afterward, the stream running higher for a day. They were inside while it passed. Ada at the table with the ledger she was still working through, annotating the entries in the margins for Hendricks in case anything further was needed, and Eli at the stove making the bread she had not gotten around to starting the day before. She looked up from the ledger and watched him work the dough. He had not looked up from what he was doing. "You're better at that than I am," she said. "I've had more practice. 20 years more, 23. She went back to the ledger. He went back to the bread. The rain tapped on the sod roof in the easy way of rain that means what it says and nothing more. It was on a morning in late May, clear and warm in the way that felt like a different category of place than the mountain he'd been living on, that Ada told him. He'd been at the woodpile and came back inside to find her standing in the center of the cabin with her hands folded in front of her. Not the crossed arms of a woman braced for an argument, just folded quietly in front of her. The specific posture of a person who has been carrying something alone for a while and is now setting it down in front of someone else. Eli. He set the wood in the bin, turned and looked at her. "The cabin is going to need another room." Her voice was careful. Level. Underneath the level was something else, the quality of a person delivering news they have already made their peace with and are now offering to someone whose peace with it matters. He went to her. He stood in front of her and looked at her face, the gray eyes, which were reading him with the full attention she gave to things that required it, and he put his hands on her shoulders. The shoulders that had carried water buckets and bullet molds and the weight of a legal case assembled from memory and every hour of every day of a winter that had been designed, by circumstance and by his own blunt stupidity, to break her. "When," he said. The word came out rough. "November, approximately." She held his eyes. "I know what November means to you on this mountain. I know what you'll be calculating. What will I be calculating? That you need to get me down the ridge before the pass closes. That you need a doctor in Bitter Creek rather than Mrs. Farwell." He said it before she could finish. "The doctor's wife. She's midwifed over 40 births in this territory. I've known her for 8 years. I trust her." He held Ada's shoulders steady under his hands. "We go down in September. We stay until it's done. I'll send Hendricks a telegraph next week to arrange the room at the hotel." She looked at him. "You'd leave the ridge. I'd leave the ridge. No hesitation. No accounting for it. The ridge will be here when we come back. The gray eyes did something he had not seen them do before. Not the filing, not the calculating, not the steady assessment that had been his first and longest education in reading her. Something more open than any of that. Something that had been living under everything else all winter, below the courage and the practicality and the particular brand of pride that didn't bend, waiting for a moment that was solid enough to rest its weight on. Okay, she said. Just that. Quiet and complete, he pulled her toward him. Both arms, the full weight of it, no reservation in it. And she put her forehead against his collarbone, stood still in a way he had never seen her stand still, not the controlled stillness of a person managing a situation, but the actual stillness of a person who has stopped managing and started resting, who has found a place that will hold her and is letting it. After a while, she pulled back and looked at him with those eyes. We need to re-chink the north wall before we go down in September, she said. The third log from the top. Second section, I used too much sand in that batch in March. It'll fail before October. He looked at her. Also, the woodshed needs to hold double what it currently does if we're going to be in Bitter Creek for 2 months, which means we start cutting in July at the latest. She met his eyes. The corner of her mouth moved, barely. I'm not going to stop thinking practically just because I told you something. I know you're not. He let his hands rest on her shoulders a moment longer. We have 4 months. 4 months, she agreed. He went out that evening after supper, while the light was still long and golden on the granite above the cabin. Around to the back of the lean-to, to the small cross in the ground. He stood there the way he had stood there through 5 winters, not to grieve, not to perform grief, but to be present at the place where one part of his life had ended and from which he had walked every day since. He stood there for a while. Then, there's going to be a room, he said quietly. A new one, off the east side, where the morning sun comes first. He paused. I thought you should know, the ridge was still, no wind. The first stars beginning to show above the granite face to the east, the sky going from blue to something deeper at the edges, the particular blue of a Colorado evening in late May that was different from every other blue. He put his hand on the top of the cross for a moment. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun. Then he went back inside, where Ada was at the table, with her planning the toolscap sheet, with the measurements for the new room sketched out in her father's daughter hand, precise and annotated, and the lamp was lit between them, and the stove was ticking, and outside the stream behind the lean-to was running clear and fast through the last of the snow melt, finding its way down the mountain the way water always found its way, around every obstacle, toward everything lower and warmer and new. He sat down across from her. She looked up, pushed the foolscap toward him so he could see the measurements. He looked at the sketch. At her handwriting in the margins, notes about the wall timber, the chinking ratio, the placement of the window to catch the eastern light. Then he picked up the pencil she'd set down and made one addition to the drawing, a small square marked off in the corner of the new room. She looked at what he'd added, a window on the south wall as well. More light. She looked up at him. More light, he said. She looked back at the drawing, nodded once, the nod of a woman who has confirmed something she already knew. She took the pencil back and added the window dimensions. The lamp burned steady between them. Outside, the May evening was settling over the ridge in the way of things that are not ending, but only changing into what they were always going to become, the light going golden, and then amber, and then the particular soft dark of a mountain night in spring, when the air smells of pine sap and wet granite, and the very distant, very clean smell of snow still on the peaks above, and everything below is awake and working toward summer with the patient, unhurried commitment of things that have waited out a long winter, and know exactly what they're doing now that the waiting is done.